2021. So I'm very, very excited today. I'm interviewing a friend of mine who's also a member of our podcast network and is going to be hosting the podcast Unthere. And I'm here with really, really, really an interesting personality, someone that really intrigues me very deeply. And I think audiences are going to love you, Neo. And I'm here with KNeo Mokgopa, who's a writer, a cultural worker, an artist, and a scholar. Neo, how are you doing?
I am fair to moderate. I'm okay. It's a difficult time, you know. It's a difficult time with everything that's happening, but I'm all right. How are you?
Look, I'm good. I think what gives me comfort is the fact that, like, we've managed to start doing the work on this platform. Where we can lend our voices in these times, because like the discourse is changing so greatly. There's so much social pressure. I mean, like, someone was saying the other day, like, remember COVID-19? Remember that? Remember the coronavirus? And there are so many intersecting things. I mean, you and I were speaking off the phone right now, offline right now, about like the intersections between it currently being the Black Lives Matter movement, the spate of femicide resurging in South Africa again, Pride Month, Youth Month, all of these things, and how do you feel about, I don't want to say the noise, but like the discursive pressure that exists right now, given the intersecting times and the intersecting conversations?
It's difficult, you know. On the one hand, when movements take place, oftentimes we like to believe, at least if it is not a reality, that a movement will be most successful when it has the spotlight.
Yeah.
But at the moment, what we're seeing are multiple movements coalescing into one very densely concentrated moment. And I think what's interesting is that perhaps for the first time on a bigger scale, we're finally seeing the intersectionalities of these movements.
Yes.
We're seeing the ways in which gender-based violence and femicide intersects with police brutality, and Black Lives Matter intersects with pride and identity and the politics of identity. You know, all of this taking place within a plague, which I think is exacerbated by economic inequality and social inequality. So we're seeing these multiple threads weaving into this dense social justice fabric. And instead of it distracting from each other, you know what I mean? So instead of one movement having to give space to another, we're saying, oh, no. This is connected to that. This is related to that. This is, this intersects.
Yeah, because I mean, I remember during the times of RMF and FMF, look, from Wits as an onlooker to RMF, Rhodes must fall for the audience. There was a time where there was a break where women formed Patriarchy Must Fall, and it became a whole controversy within the movement itself. How can you, detract from the broader movement? This was men. How can you detract from the broader movement, the broader conversation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? But women were like, no, like, we cannot have a conversation about defacing institutional figures of oppression without speaking about the oppression of women. And the queer community was like, we cannot speak of the same without speaking about the oppression of our own bodies. And like that, there's never been a collective sense of empathy. But as you say, like, the plague has put people in a position where they could actually truly empathize and connect all the dots, right?
And I think it's actually very interesting what you're saying. The, the, the ideas surrounding Rhodes Must Fall, at least in rhetoric and in theory, would necessarily have to include patriarchy must fall.
Yes.
And the fact that it had to be made explicit was an interesting, sense of this, of juncture or plurality.
Yes.
It's almost, this is a strange example to bring up, but so Kopano Ratele writes this book, The World Looks Like This From Here. And broadly speaking, it's about a number of issues, but the site of the research is African psychology. And he makes this really interesting point that when you have to say African, when you say African psychology,
yeah,
it almost undermines it, because then it continues psychology being understood as Western.
Yes.
So the point that he makes is that we should be able to say psychology and immediately move from African psychology.
Yes.
We should be able to say psychology and see it from where we are,
Yes.
without having to qualify it. Because when we qualify it, we let psychology off the hook to remain dominated by Western psychology. But I bring this up in the sense that Rhodes Must Fall should never have had to say patriarchy must fall too.
Yes. Wow.
When
Yes.
when that is said, it in some ways then says that Rhodes Must Fall does not have patriarchy must fall woven into it. And that's the sadness in
or Rhodes Must Fall has nothing to do with patriarchy, or Rhodes has nothing to do with patriarchy.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And in many ways, it was an attempt to kind of make it explicit that Rhodes Must Fall includes patriarchy must fall.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, rhetorically, it does then kind of give space in an interesting way.
Sure. Wow. I mean, what I think is going to be fascinating is the fact that, you speak very boldly about these issues in your podcast, and you speak very boldly about these issues in general as a writer. Because just for the audience to understand, Unthere, the podcast, I approached KNeo at the back of the release of Unthere, the column that they write on, the Daily Maverick.
Yes.
And it's a very, very fantastic column. And I'm actually going to grab an extract from that column, if you don't mind, just so the audience can just dig into your mind further. And I was like, no, why don't we adapt this column into a podcast series, right? Because what I like about podcasting is that the form is, I don't want to say, the form is so deep, and it is almost as deep as writing. It's not as deep as writing, never be. But it could never be, right? But it is almost as deep in the sense that it is long form. The voice of the actual podcaster, is allowed to express great depths, and audiences are so intimately listening to the voice of the podcaster. And before I get into your podcast, what I think is interesting about your literary voice now, and I've spoken to this about you in private, your literary voice is poetry, it's song, it's journalism, it's commentary, it's thought leadership. It's all of these things in a very, very delicious cocktail. And only your voice can do that kind of thing. Can you just unpack your literary voice for a second? Maybe this is just for me. Maybe not even for an audience. For me, unpack your literary voice, because I think it's profound in your writing, and having listened to your podcast as well, in your podcast.
Sure, that's quite a task. In many ways, I don't know, and I think in many ways I'm still wrestling with that literary voice. I think some of the principles that undergird my voice is to be accessible and approachable. And I think it's a thing that I strangely struggle with. I think having gone to Anglo-Saxon schooling my whole life, I think I grew up very much idolizing Anglophilia, or like Western ways of being and writing and speaking and dressing and eating, you know? But in that space, I grew very convoluted, you know, very kind of polysyllabic words and institutionalized hypervisibility, and you know what I mean? And that language. And I think, but at the same time, I also discovered poetry as a way of finding expression, self-expression, but also ways of looking inside, you know? And I think the more I wrote, the more I struggled to see the differences. In a poem, I am exploring the same things that I would explore in an academic piece of writing, in an article, in an essay, or whatever. And I'm seeing more and more, it's being brought to my attention that there is a poetic license often that's being used, but I think at the same time, it's not used for flair or beauty. It's used as at least in my intention, to get to the truth, you know?
Yes.
And I think sometimes poetry is able to articulate a truth that the formal structures of grammar don't really allow for, you know?
True.
So the title Unthere, you know, it's just the word Unthere is not strictly speaking a word, but with poetic license, you can construct it. You can imbue it with, you can use it as a vehicle to express ideas and feelings, you know, and experiences. And I think that I'm deeply fascinated by academia. I believe in some senses in academia's ability to advocate for social change. But at the same time, I'm also very much against in this kind of this academic ruling class or academic elite that is unapproachable, inaccessible, you know? And so in many ways, I try to use the ideas that exist within the academy in a social setting, with language that is accessible, and with grammar from poetry that is emotionally impactful.
Yes, that's very powerful. And this is something I've often complained about, is that like when I was at Wits, the conversations on campus are profoundly important conversations. And what ends up happening is that, and you actually said this about UCT when I had a conversation with you like in 2015, and I never actually forgot what you said. You were like, UCT is like an ivory tower, right? It's a really marvelous, inaccessible place. And these conversations and these protests and the way that they happen here and here alone. They don't get transported with the kid back to Joburg, almost. They don't get transported back to Khayelitsha. And I was saying this about Wits as well. Like when we speak about Black radical feminism, for example, it's difficult to take that in the taxi to Bree, from Bree to home, to Soweto, Deep Blue. It's difficult. And the task often is for people who are in that space and have had the benefit of that discourse and that content to spread it. And I think that's so important. And I think you're doing it so well in the poetic sense.
Thank you. Thank you.
Man. Let me actually read an extract, from your Daily Maverick piece. And this is from, it's titled Black Bodies and White People. It was published 10 March 2020, okay? And you say, when the ghost train crashed through the living room, the impact did not slow its momentum. Almost instantaneously, the structure and foundation whirled around me. The doors became floors, the windows became ceilings, the table a chair, the chair became my son was missing. The Glenn Gray Act, 100 Years of War, the revolt of Chief Langalibelele, the leg left in Lusaka, the Sharpeville massacre, the mines, the death squads. He has another family now, quote unquote, the Black Administration Act, the rent laborers, forced removals. The train kept crashing and crashing through. Carriage after blinding carriage of an onslaught poured through the walls' mangled mouths, opened by the train. Unbelievable. Absolutely amazing. And like from that, just from that extract now, my question to you now is, take us through your lens. How do you see the world? How do you, as KNeo Mokgopa, see the world?
I mean, you really are having me with these difficult questions.
I want to meet you where you are. I told you. Like, I can't, I want to respect you. I want to meet you where you are. It's your fault, you know? You can't blame me.
I think first and foremost, I think history is important.
Yes.
I think that at least it is very difficult to understand the world as it currently exists without having a mind for history.
Yes, true.
I think I also tend to see the world through very structural paradigms.
Yes.
And by this, I mean structural in the sense of categories, of systems, of what does having Blackness in your body mean and do, what does gender identity mean and do, what does your class experience look like, what does geographic spatial planning do to your experience of the world. So there's history and then there's structuralism. But at the same time, I think that there is also, there is a moreness, you know? There is an iridescent, there is a greater than the sum of its parts-ness to the ways in which we experience the world that cannot be sufficiently articulated or expressed through structuralism. So if I say I am a queer Black individual who, broadly speaking, is somewhere in the middle classes, university education. So yes, so all of those structures of oppression and privilege, fine, but I'm also human, you know? And there are very intimate traumas that motivate how I experience the world.
Oh, yes.
And I think those are my guiding ways in which that, well, I think that would be the lens in which I see the world and I read the world as well. And I think, with those three grounding areas, I think I try to know what it means to be here. I mean, an easy example. So I live in Braamfontein, next to the Braamfontein Cemetery.
Yeah.
And the cemetery has these very tall trees. And it's a beautiful cemetery. On the Johannesburg Parks website, it describes it as the grand old dame of cemeteries. It's beautiful. Wow. It's got these old and sculpted angels overlooking, you know, the graves. It's got these walkways, these incredible trees. But what isn't immediately seen is the history, right?
Yes.
So the Braamfontein Cemetery originally was built for what they term nonconformists, in the sense that they could not be buried in religious cemeteries, you know, Christian and Hindu and otherwise. But then the question becomes, where do Black people fit in that paradigm? And it turned out that there was a section built for Black people, at least specifically for Black miners, non-Christian Black people who also come from the mines.
Yeah.
It's called the School of Mines, and it's from where I'm sitting, on the left-hand side of the cemetery. Mm-hmm. And Black people, when they were unearthing their loved ones, could not afford tombstones and otherwise. or even coffins in many cases. And so they would take the leaves and the branches and the twigs of nearby trees surrounding the cemetery, and to help mask the smell. So they would use eucalyptus trees, which has a very nice smell, so that it would cover the smell of their loved one's flesh, rotting. But over time, those little twigs and leaves and otherwise, they germinated and they grew. And that's why you have a forest in the Braamfontein Cemetery, because all of these people unearth their loved ones with bits of tree, and this huge forest blooms. And so on the one hand, it is a beautiful cemetery that is lined with these tall, magnificent, glorious trees. But the reason you have those trees, is an unspeakable injustice. And I think that's so I'm looking at it from an aesthetics point of view, from an experiential, but also that history of how did it become like this becomes very important. So now when I look at the Braamfontein Cemetery, I don't see the grand old dame of cemeteries that is nothing but beautiful. I see the mark of injustice, I see another space in which South Africa's mining industrial complex and system has created another site of pain and suffering for Black people,
And it's so poetic that it's sad, it's deeply sad, but it's poetic that the trees bloom and they get to live forever. You know what I mean? Like those Black miners, those Black people in the end were rewarded by nature and defied being buried, perhaps, defied dying in the mines of Central Joburg, and blossomed and bloomed out of this ground and became far bigger tombstone structures that you'd find in the Braam Cemetery. That's so incredible. And I want you to define Unthere as a concept before you tell us some nitty-gritties about the podcast.
Sure.
Yeah.
So Unthere, okay, so before even Unthere, I, of course, being a young person in South Africa who lived through Rhodes Must Fall, Peace Must Fall, became very strongly introduced to the ideas of decolonization and why it's important and why it's needed, of course. But at the same time, you're also being introduced to other ideas of patriarchy, of femicide, of gender, of capitalism.
For sure.
And I think it occurred to me that there were experiences, there were stories, there were ways of knowing the world that were suffocated by what you might call colonialism. So, I mean, an easy example is gender in the ways in which at least Oyewumi Oyeronke writes about, and that gender is a paradigm or an identity that is enforced onto people through colonization, in many ways at least. But over time become suffocated, and Black people begin identifying exclusively as either one or the other, as two, as one, female and male, man and woman. And there are many different ways of existing that are kind of pushed out of the center through that process. I came across there's a book written somewhere in the States where this young person grows up in a small town. They leave during their young adult years to go work. They come back and their town is not there anymore. And the writer says there was no there. And it was also used by Bush in reference to many atrocities. When he gets accused of atrocities, let's say it be in the Iraq War, Bush responds, "There's no there. It's not a thing," And I think that's where at least the linguistics of Unthere comes from. And for me, an Unthere is twofold. One, it is thing, you know, it is space, it is knowledge, it is experience, it is, you know, object. And it is Unthere, not to say that it is not there, because it is, right? It's
yes.
like when you are in the middle of Johannesburg in 1948, and it is this glowing city with beautiful finishes and the rest of it. The mine dumps are lined just on the outskirts of Johannesburg, and they obscure the sight of Soweto. So Soweto is not there. Well, it is there, but it's not there, right? You can't see it. The mine dumps delineate the end of the world, or at least your world. And in the shadow of the mine dumps exists this Unthere, you know, this non-space, which exists, but not in the same ways in which your world exists. So an Unthere is a that then, a knowledge, an experience of the world, a place, an identity that exists whilst being oppressed, whilst being smothered out of knowledge, you know?
Wow.
At the same time, an Unthere is a verb. It is to Unthere, to do it, right? But here it takes a little bit more of a revolutionary aspect in the sense that it decenters hegemonic identities, experiences, and otherwise.
I mean, yeah, that's
Do you want to start a new? We have less than 1 minute. Do you want to start a new?
Yes, I want to start a new one. So let me just stop this recording, save it. I want to start a new one just now, okay?